Hi everyone, welcome or welcome back to another video. As you could probably tell by the title, today I wanted to talk about narratives of colonial Siberia in the early Russian 19th century. Anyone who knows me at all knows that I'm so fascinated by Russia in general. I'm a history major and I have taken a lot of courses on Russian history, Russian literature, and Russian culture, so I'm very excited to be sharing this with you today. This video might be a little bit more academic or formal in tone than my other videos, but I really hope that doesn't put you off. With that being said, let's get started. Before we really dive in, however, I would like to note that this video was very heavily influenced by an article by Mark Bass entitled Inventing Siberia, Visions of the Russian East in the Early 19th Century, which can be found on JStor and will be linked in the description of this video for further reading. Before we really get started, however, I would like to give a little bit of context. As I'm sure some of you may know, the Russian Empire was one of the biggest empires in history, far bigger than the Greek, Roman, and Ottoman empires, and Siberia spans approximately half of this territory. To put this physical geography into perspective, Siberia is approximately 4 times larger than India, which was absolutely wild to me when I first learned that. I think it goes without saying that the topic of Russian Siberian colonization is a massive undertaking. Both Russia and Siberia are home to immensely rich and controversial histories, which is why I'm focusing on this video not on Russian Siberian exploitation or imperialism or anything so historically concrete, but rather on the Siberian image. By this I mean the ways Siberia was viewed by native Russians living in Russia's mainland or the Russian metropolis. It must also be noted that in modern academia there is a debate on the boundaries between a nation and an empire. While I'm very much aware that modern empires, like the British or Spanish empires, usually base their status of empire on the acquisition and control of overseas colonies, something that Russia does not and never had, I still personally consider Russia to be an empire. There are a lot of people who argue that the absorption of countries like Ukraine, known as Little Russia, or Belarus, known as White Russia, into Russia as a whole simply makes it a country focused on territorial expansion. I personally disagree with this. I think that historically Tsarist Russia was bigger than a single nation, hence its categorization as an empire. Other significant features like the sheer size of the Russian territory and the immense diversity of the population also contribute to Russia's status as an empire, at least to me. If this interests you and you would like to learn more about the discourses between nation and empire through a historical Russian lens, I would really recommend the book titled Russia's Empires by Ronald Gregor Suni and Valery A. Kivelson, which covers both historic Russian colonization and philosophical-minded explorations of empire as a concept. It's an incredible book. I really enjoyed it and I very highly recommend it. Now to actually jump onto Siberia. I'm very positive that there existed many hundreds or maybe even thousands of differing opinions on Siberia in the early Russian 19th century. Nonetheless, in this video, I'm going to cover 4 perspectives, that being the Russian imperial image of Siberia, the Decembrist conception of Siberia, the nationalist Russian Siberian vision, and Siberia through the eyes and minds of Alexander Herzen, who is a prominent Russian thinker that I will cover more in the rest of the video. I'm going to start this video off by talking about the Russian imperial image, also known as the Russian colonial image, which was held by many Russians west of the Ural Mountains. For context, the exact border between Europe and Asia has been pretty highly contested, and prior to the 18th century, or early 18th century at least, the Don River line was commonly accepted as the split between these two continents. In the 1730s, however, geographer and historian Vasily N. Tatashev, forgive me if I say that wrong, shifted this boundary from the Don River line to the Ural Mountains, which was far further east. This meant that Siberia became, basically in one stroke, both alien and exoticized, and cut off from civilized European Russia. Therefore, Russians west of the Urals looked toward Siberia in a way that was almost similar to the way the British looked toward their colonies, so for example, India. Now, as previously stated, in the eyes of the Russian colonial image, Siberia's existence for a significant period of time was something akin to a colony, one that garnered a considerable amount of capital for the Russian state in the form of fur and other natural resources, since the Siberian fur trade started in around the 16th century. However, the loss of Siberia's economic significance, coupled with the redemarcation of the Euro-Asia border, recast Siberia as a remote Asiatic colony. Siberia thus represented a former period of imperialism, and its only use in the modern 19th century was as a place of exile. Past passion for Siberia as a Russian, quote, gold mine dissolved as people started to wonder if the space provided any value to its motherland at all. Throughout its history, the Russian Empire was consistently seen by the British Empire and other Western European empires almost as a secondary sort of European empire, one that was, of course, more civilized than barbaric and Oriental Asia, but considerably less so than the West. Much of Russia's imperial history surrounds itself with the question of its relation and comparison to real European empires. Thus, now that Siberia no longer brought extensive mercantile value to the empire, Siberia's image as an anti-European archetype was solidified, and it was increasingly viewed as a burden that challenged Russian claims to a real European identity. Its characterization as, quote, an outback or, quote, a stagnant Asiatic environment was supported by the Russian government, who worried that a rejuvenated economy and civil life in Siberia would lead to Siberian separatism, which was an especially relevant fear at the time because many of the Western European empires were losing or starting to lose their own colonies. Siberia was therefore viewed almost like a Russian East India, with its local people assuming a relationship to the Western Russians that paralleled that of the indigenous Americans with their Western European conquerors. Keep in mind that if Siberia separated, it would look really, really bad for the Russian Empire because it had lost a territory, but also because Siberia was approximately half of the Russian Empire, there would exist another nation or empire that could rival that of Russia, since they would be approximately the same size. On the other hand, however, those who disagreed regarding Russia's autocratic status quo viewed Siberia in a fundamentally different manner, and it was these individuals that made up the Decembrist conception of Siberia. Those titled Decembrists were people who had taken part in the Decembrist revolt, which was a failed coup d'etat led by a liberal military and political dissidents against the Russian Empire in December of 1825, after the death of Tsar Alexander I. Decembrists were primarily members of the Russian upper classes with military backgrounds, and many of them had been exposed to liberal ideas and political possibilities when serving in the Russian occupation of France after the Napoleonic Wars or elsewhere in Western Europe in general. A few of them were members of secret patriotic and later revolutionary societies in Russia. Decembrists failed to swear fealty to the new Tsar Nicholas I and demanded that his brother Constantine instead be sworn into the throne. Additionally, they wanted the Russian autocratic system to be changed into a constitutional monarchy. So, quite a few demands. Historians also believe that the Decembrists may have been influenced by the United States Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, as the Decembrist Constitution, which was written by Nikita Muravoyev. I'm so sorry if I'm butchering these names. I do not speak Russian. The Decembrist Constitution was very similar to the American Constitution. For his role in the Decembrist uprising, Nikita was sentenced to death, which was later commuted to 20 years of hard labor. It's important to note also that the Decembrists were firmly against American slavery and in fact believe in the freedom of all slaves, leading them to fight for the abolishment of Russian serfdom. Unfortunately, the Decembrist revolt was quite easily suppressed by Tsar Nicholas's troops, and most of the Decembrists were sent either into exile or execution. With this in mind, it's possible to understand why the Decembrists saw Siberia as a radical or even democratic model where much wanted progressive ideals could be identified. Siberia, with its absence of serfdom, chattel slavery, and landed aristocracy, was therefore a source of hope and inspiration. Its lack of a class structure also appealed to the exiled Decembrists, who drew a connection between Siberia and the American New World that they so heavily admired as a powerful inspirational symbol for political liberation. Like the New World, Siberia appeared to be a young and developing society that was not only unbound by long histories of Russian autocratic tradition, but one that was also promised to fulfill dreams that could no longer be found in the Europeanized Russian West. To the exiled Decembrists and similar thinkers then, Siberia was therefore a colony that still fit neatly into the vision of Russia as an imperial identity, while still containing many of the qualities necessary for the progressive advancement of Russia, and was consequently highly admired. The third view on Siberia, that being the Russian nationalist vision, reached its peak during the reign of Nicholas I, which stated that Russians' attempt at following the Europeanized model had prevented itself from realizing its own national destiny. Siberia's reputation as remote, Asiatic, and Oriental thus became a way of proving Russian validity without explicitly westernizing itself, and its conquest demonstrated that Russians were not any less worthy in their own exploits. "We did not discover America," wrote a prominent Russian historian, "but we opened up a third of Asia, and doesn't this supplement Columbus's discovery?" In this, it's possible to see how Russia's status as a secondary European empire weighed heavily on its people, and that enormous amounts of energy were expended trying to defend accusations of Russian inferiority in comparison to the West. Russian conquerors of Siberia were thus redrawn as courageous and patriotic sons of the fatherland, furthering the view that Siberia was a positive and powerful way to separate Russian history and image from the sphere of European civilization. Furthermore, the depiction of Siberia's native people as savagely pagan provided Russia more opportunity to legitimize its empire, as it brought Christian civilization and spiritual enlightenment to Siberia's indigenous population, colonizing rhetoric that was also used by a lot of Western European empires to justify the domination of their own conquered territories. Alongside Russia's, quote, humanitarian national achievement, came to the romanticization of Siberia's wild and unspoiled physical geography that tied in with the belief that Siberia could be developed in the same way as the American Wild West. In this Russian nationalist conception of Siberia allowed Russia to portray itself as the leader of a proud new world, just as Western Europe did with the Americas. This allowed the Russian Empire to validate its own existence and power, beside and even in contrast to its Western European counterparts. The last examined viewpoint on Siberia comes from the Russian perspective of Alexander Herzen and all of the people that agreed with his way of thinking. Alexander Herzen was an extremely prominent political thinker, activist, and writer that was hailed as the father of Russian socialism. Growing up, Herzen's status as the illegitimate son of a wealthy Russian nobleman and a poor German woman bred inside of him a resentment for both authority and the autocratic serf-based Russian order. Funnily enough, this resentment also manifested in an ardent commitment to the Decembrist cause, so much so that he swore with a friend to dedicate their entire lives to continuing the Decembrist struggle for freedom in Russia. At first, Herzen was a Westernizer, someone who believed that Russia's future lay with the liberal reforms of Western Europe. But he quickly switched to his own path after viewing up close the failed revolutions of 1848. Disillusioned, Herzen embraced anarchist socialism and became convinced that Russia's future now lay in the formation of socialist peasant communes. Europe's role as a progressive historical force was too imbued with the values of the past to change the existing social order. This, coupled with the fact that Western institutions were basically dead, guided Herzen to turn his heart and mind back to Russia. By merging his distaste for the Russian autocracy with his opinions on Siberia, Herzen created a new and radically de-Europeanized version of Russia. Herzen, who believed very firmly in his peasant communes, thought that the Siberian peasant was both smarter and physically healthier than their Western Russian equivalents. His characterization of Siberia as an undeniably primordial and raw space placed a positive twist on attributes that had historically been viewed as negative. In his work titled Before the Storm, found inside of his book From the Other Shore, Herzen characterizes history as cyclical, believing that civilization and empires go through an infinite spiral of lifetimes where they move through periods of backwardness and progress. His perspective of Siberia as an unsculpted territory that was in the state of being born thus meant that Siberia contained inside of it all of the potential of youth, potential that was magnified by the fact that it was uncorrupted by centuries of oppressive autocratic tradition. Unlike Western Europe, which was now stagnant, uninspirational, and nearing the end of its lifetime, Siberia contained inside of it all of the elements necessary to further the Russian path of development. In time, however, the qualities and potential that Herzen assigned to Siberia shifted to encapsulate all of Russia, or more specifically, the genuine Russia of the unspoiled common people. Siberia, and by extension, Russia, was thus presented as proof of the Russian ability to achieve independent historical accomplishment and progress. Alongside this was Herzen's belief that empire as a concept was foreign to Russia and destructive to its people. Herzen thus supported the notion of Siberian liberation even as he spoke of the Russian-Siberian potential for perfect progress. So, of course, all four of these perspectives were in some way colonial since they came through the eyes of Russians who lived west of the Ural Mountains. The popular Russian conception of Siberia as basically empty and Siberia as a place in which you can do whatever you want was obviously wrong because Siberia had a whole population of indigenous peoples. If you are interested in stories of Siberian indigenous peoples and the way they reacted to, for example, Russian invaders, Russian colonizers, or just the way they lived in general, I would recommend the book Chukchi Bible by a man named Yuri Rithu, who was a Russian writer around the time of the Soviet Union, but he had heritage to Siberia's indigenous peoples. That's all I have today. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know, and I truly, truly hope that you learned something. If you would like any more content on Russia in general, like Russian history or the Russian intelligentsia or even Russian literature, please let me know in the comments. I would love to do more, and I hope you will have a lovely day. I'll see you next time.